The faith of martyrs and confessors, like those who survived to bear witness, is a far cry from the therapeutic religion of the middle-class suburbs, the sermonizing of politicized congregations of the left and the right, and the health and wealth message of prosperity gospel churches. These and other feeble forms of the faith will be quickly burned away in the face of the slightest persecution. Pastor Richard Wurmbrand once wrote that there were two kinds of Christians, those who sincerely believe in God and those who, just as sincerely, believe that they believe. You can tell them apart by their actions in decisive moments. That is an excerpt from the book Live Not by Lies by Rod Dreher, which I will be reviewing here today. I will be giving a summary overview of the book's content, leaving you to read in much more detail the case that Mr. Dreher makes in the book, and drawing where it seems helpful some application out of my own ministry and life. He begins the book by making the case for what we face, noting that there are ominous parallels between life in the early 20th century in Europe, in the cultures and countries that became totalitarian by the time of World War II, and what we are facing currently in the United States of America and the West more generally. And he asks, what ripens a people for totalitarianism, whether it be of the hard or soft variety, and he will define those more closely in the book. He notes the perennial appeal of the Marxist narrative, especially to the young, or in the face of nihilistic philosophy in general. And it must be noted that any philosophy, whether of the left or the right, that says we define our own ends for ourselves, our own morals for ourselves, our own meaning for ourselves, is a nihilistic philosophy. And of course, he notes that social movements tend to move from the intelligentsia out into the broader culture. And he gives a very helpful demonstration of this from history, recounting how communism couldn't get any purchase in the minds of the largely religious people of Russia until after a generation's worth of work, the communists influenced the intelligentsia so the intelligentsia could then influence the peasantry and prepare the way for the Bolshevik Revolution. He does an in-depth overview of Hannah Arendt's work in her book, The Origins of Totalitarianism. She notes several important factors that prepare any people for totalitarianism. And the first of these is loneliness and social atomization. Totalitarian movements, said Arendt, are mass organizations of atomized, isolated individuals. The constituent members of what we perceive as a mass movement all perceive themselves as cut off even from one another, but their energies are directed by people who are opportunistic in using their frustration. There's a parallel, of course, to our own culture, even before the coming of the COVID-19 restrictions, which we're all living under. Sociologists, since the publication of Robert Putnam's Bowling Alone, have noted that we have been increasingly isolated as people. And even the rise of social media has served to further heighten our sense of being cut off from one another rather than being more connected. Arendt notes that people losing faith in hierarchies and the institutions of a culture prepares them for totalitarianism. In the 60s, they cried, "Don't trust anybody over 30." And now those very people are in charge of the institutions they told us not to trust. Arendt noted that there was a terrifying negative solidarity among people from diverse classes who were all united in their belief that all political parties were populated by fools. My own seminary education looked a lot like that as well. As we were taught primarily to distrust the narratives of the Scripture we were going to be required to preach upon every Sunday. To distrust the history of the church. I'm not talking about having an honest sense of where the church had failed and repenting sincerely of those failures, when the hermeneutic of suspicion, which we were told about, almost became a hermeneutic of paranoia. Treat everything as though it's suspect until you can prove otherwise, even the church you're called to serve. My late mother-in-law heard a sermon by her pastor long before I became a Christian, and I've been a Christian for 25 years, where he noted that in the 1960s they wanted to tear down the institutions, and now there were no more institutions left to tear down, and wondered at the plight of the young. She quoted it so many times it really captured her imagination, and I think it points to the very kind of dynamic that Arendt notes here in our own culture. She notes that there's a desire to transgress and destroy. The simple joy of destruction becomes something celebrated. The post-World War I generation of writers and artists were marked by their embrace and celebration of anti-cultural philosophies and acts as a way of demonstrating contempt for established hierarchies, institutions, and ways of thinking. Arendt said of some writers who glorified the will to power, they read not Darwin, but the Marquis de Sade. That's an excerpt from the book. Philosopher Charles Taylor out of Canada has noted that we live in a time of anti-culture. If you define a culture by any traditional sociological or anthropological metric. Under Serrano's Piss Christ and pictures of male homosexual practices that were all the rage when I was an undergraduate in the arts, this is the kind of aberrant behavior or simple desire to be transgressive that she's talking about here. And that was, again, 25, 30 years ago. I note with my own children, as they're 14 and 16 now, we tend to watch sitcoms together so we can process them together. One of our favorites is Brooklyn Nine-Nine, and the characters are genuinely lovable in there and basically good people. But the prominent and frequent mention of aberrant sexual practices, whether heterosexual, homosexual, or otherwise, as just kind of part of the scenery of what normal people are and do, points to this desire to be constantly transgressive. And of course, there is also the prevalence of irony in our entertainment dialogue. You almost never see and can scarcely imagine any kind of discussion of a classical virtue untinged by irony in that context. And I'm not just talking about sitcoms here, I'm talking about even serious movies. Can you imagine a conversation about prudence, temperance, or fortitude delivered in less than an ironic tone of voice? But this was the mainstay of people like Jane Austen's work. Justice of the classical virtues remains, but it's distinctively not defined as regulatory of our relationships with others apart from the exercise of power for well-defined social goals. Traditionally, justice was considered directly related to, the virtue of justice was considered directly related to virtues like religion and piety and gratitude. Religion and piety and gratitude are all not only in short supply in our culture, they're actively mocked most places. The martial virtues, like strength, honor, noblesse oblige, or self-sacrifice, are rarely touched on, although self-sacrifice gets a nod now and then, as long as it's for the right politically approved cause. And of course, the theological virtues of faith, hope, and charity are not even on the radar anymore. Almost all earnest dialogue in our modern entertainment media is related to protagonists working to overcome an irrational, overwhelming, and an insensate kind of evil that's pressing in on them and impinging particularly upon their personal sense of self. We almost can't imagine anything that's evil that has any other dynamic. All of this, married to the simple joy of destruction, creates a terribly caustic brew. Arendt notes, the members of the elite did not object at all to paying a price, the destruction of civilization, for the fun of seeing how Those who had been excluded unjustly in the past forced their way into it. Arendt also notes that something you'll see that was common amongst all the cultures that became totalitarian and was propaganda and the willingness to believe useful lies. I hardly need say that whether from the political left or the political right in the current West, and particularly in the United States of America, fact-checking is at a minimum as long as the story progresses the cause. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez recently biffed in just this way, even to where the Washington Post had to criticize her a bit, saying it was less important in an interview to be precisely, factually, and semantically correct than to be morally right. Facts were less important than the cause. The 1619 Project is a great public example of this right now from the left. Easily disproved by any reference to the original documents of the founding, particularly the Declaration of Independence and its earlier drafts, you can simply see that the American Revolutionary War was not fought to protect the institution of slavery. But it doesn't matter as long as it makes the cause move forward. A mania for ideology ties in closely with this willingness to believe useful lies. Again, a quote from the book, the desperation alienated people have for a story that helps them make sense of their lives and tells them what to do explains it. For a man desperate to believe, totalitarian ideology is more precious than life itself. He may even be willing to help in his own persecution and frame his own death sentence if only his status as a member of the movement is not touched. Prosecution, not persecution. I was inspired to go into ministry by Robert Jensen's 1993 article, How the World Lost Its Story. People without a story need a story to make sense of the data around them. Meta-narratives are not an option, they are a requirement. Phrases like the personal is political are the canaries in our social coal mines. We need to pay great attention. She notes a society that values loyalty more than expertise is also on its way towards totalitarianism. Donald Trump said this, I value loyalty above everything else, more than brains, more than drive, more than energy. Whether it come from the political right or the political left, a politics of loyalty prepares people for totalitarianism. And today, companies monitor the social media accounts of their employees, and Mr. Dreher gives several examples of this, given on condition of anonymity in the book. Can you imagine a generation ago, or 2 generations ago, this sort of thing happening? I live in the Lehigh Valley. Bethlehem Steel, I couldn't imagine an executive from Bethlehem Steel showing up at the local pub or Society of Irish Workers or anything like this and listening into conversations and people getting fired or demoted on Monday morning for what they said in those locations. It's a terrifying precedent and one we should be paying attention to. Intellectuals do indeed chart the course for a society by influencing its networks and the institutions that are part of them. That ends Arendt's analysis, but I would point you here to the work of Neil Ferguson. If you don't have time to read his book, The Circle and the Square, I commend to you his National Public Television miniseries talking about the rise of modern networks. Another quote from the book, though. In radicalizing the broader class of elites, social justice warriors are playing a similar historic role to the Bolsheviks in pre-revolutionary Russia. SJW ranks are full of middle-class, secular, educated young people racked by guilt and anxiety over their own privilege, alienated from their own traditions, and desperate to identify with something or someone to give them a sense of wholeness and purpose. These are the products of our confirmation programs and youth ministries. They're collectively the efforts of the church, and parents who were doing what every generation of parents has always tried to do, give their own kids a better life than they had. Now the efforts of all the people around them to raise them right become the evidence that they have experienced unwarranted privilege and are unjust by nature. They're seeing the same data we're seeing, but they understand it completely differently. And it becomes for them evidence that they need to engage in penitential activism in order to atone for the sins of their parents. The Italian socialist Antonio Gramsci once said that there needed to be a long march through the institutions of the West if the West was ever to become communist or Marxist. That long march has left the faithful remnant of the church in all its fractured splendor with much work to do. Dreher goes on to note progressivism as a religion is another force preparing the way for this soft totalitarianism in our culture. H. Richard Niebuhr, in his classic book, The Kingdom of God in America, lamented that the theological liberalism of his day preached that a God without wrath brought men without sin into a kingdom without judgment through the ministrations of a Christ without a cross. As that narrative slowly took central stage in the largely unlamented mainline denominations, now lost, and through broad swaths of the Roman Catholic Church, an eviscerated gospel was increasingly preached from our pulpits. It was a message more palatable to the self-satisfied and satiated generation that followed the World War II greatest generation, whose primary goal was just to get a piece for themselves of the largest economic boom in history. It was the sort of low-cost, low-content Christianity that Bonhoeffer excoriated as both the fruit and the seed of cheap grace. This emaciated pseudo-gospel could not hold the imaginations of new catechumens, whether the children of the church or the increasingly few numbers of people who inquired at her door. Consequently, the religious institutions that spiritually formed the majority of the American intellectuals that shaped the political, educational, communication, and business networks of our culture lost their influence over the key influencers. Consequently, those downstream from them in the cultural networks were cut loose from even the salutary sway of the Christian story. And of course, modern secularism, whether of the left or the right, has rushed to fill the void and so created and worked actively to widen the gap between the church's proclamation and the places in our culture where the stories by which we make sense of our life are told. Augustine identified human beings as homo religiosus, the religious animal. It's interesting to me that increasing numbers of prominent atheists and ex-adherents of Western progressivism are identifying modern-day woke culture as a religion, one that has a cultish shape. The final dynamic, and perhaps I think the most important thing he notes here, from a standpoint of the fact that Rod Dreher's book will likely tend to be read more by religious conservatives than by religious liberals, the final dynamic he notes is the rise of surveillance capitalism. This is important for those raised in the era of the Cold War who tend to associate free market capitalism with an alliance with the social right and religious freedom. Because now the incentives of the market and the new models of the market based on a constant stream of technology delivered data about consumers, these have given disproportionate influence to those at network hubs and loud voices, however few their number, and those willing to mobilize to mob the feedback loops of social media have an amazing amount of incredible influence. Woke culture has far more quickly come to the big companies of the world than traditional social conservatives could have ever imagined. And so now the free market works to undermine many of the values that Cold War-era people believed it tended to protect. It's a danger to which Cold War-era conservatives are largely blind. The second half of Dreher's book, once he has made the case for why we need to be paying attention to the ominous parallels between our culture and what has happened before in the rise of totalitarian cultures, is how to live in the truth, how to resist. He says that we must value nothing more than the truth. This is the first key thing he identified through talking with survivors of those former totalitarian systems. This is going to require us to choose a life apart from the crowd. And I was reminded of a saying of the Desert Father that he doesn't quote, but which I've heard. It says, "If you would be known by God, be unknown by the world." Purposely choosing a different way is going to lead to lost opportunities, especially economic opportunities for Christians. So we are going to have to choose what is most important to us. We're going to have to reject doublethink and fight for free speech. One of the most important words I learned from this book that I was not exposed to before is the word ketman. And here's how he defines it. He says, "This is the Persian word for the practice of maintaining an outward appearance of Islamic orthodoxy while inwardly dissenting. Ketman was the strategy everyone who wasn't a true believer in communism had to adopt to stay out of trouble. It is a form of mental self-defense. What is the difference between ketman and plain old hypocrisy? Poet and activist Czesław Miłosz explained that having to be on all the time inevitably changes a person. An actor who inhabits his role around the clock eventually becomes the character he plays. Ketman is worse than hypocrisy, because living by it all the time corrupts your character and ultimately everything in society." I didn't have this concept when I had a conversation a couple of weeks ago with a 20-something social justice warrior who was home from college, and we were talking, and she couldn't understand why free speech was so important, especially as it related to transsexuals. She thought the right of transsexuals, and frankly anybody, to define themselves however they wanted, ought to trump the right for free speech. But free speech protects free inquiry. As any reader of George Orwell knows, without a word, you can't have a concept. And so we need to be able to ask free questions and speak freely about people if we're to get to the truth. To not live with a constant state of ketman is already becoming difficult for confessing Christians. And we need to at least begin by becoming aware of when we are betraying our conscience, so we can cherish truth-telling and be prudent. And this is the crux of the practice engaged here. We need to be careful what we say, but silence can at times be a form of social resistance. We need to see, judge, and act. See what's going on, judge what is the right way to move forward, and act. And this becomes the refrain of the second half of the book. Another thing we can do to resist totalitarianism is to cultivate cultural memory. For the church, whose job is to tell again and again in each generation the story of God's mighty acts of salvation, this should be mother's milk. But this may in some ways be new ground for us Protestants, whose approach to the gospel has tended to be more propositional and personal. Cultural memory is a completely different kind of thing. It's memory that lives more in our bones and less in our minds. Here I think of Robert Jensen's aphorism from that article I referenced before. But a task of singular importance for the church in the coming era might simply to be the church. To be the narratable world in which God's story is not only proclaimed, but lived as though it is true. We form a bridge between an imperfect living out of that in the life of the church herself. An imperfect bridge between a coherent past and a hopeful future. I think that both local and universal customs like Saints' Days will contribute to this over time. At my own church, I've begun to celebrate Saints' Days that I've never done before, thinking that my church family needs to know its family history. And that history has to go a little bit further back and run a little bit deeper than simply what happened here in Moore Township outside of Nazareth, Pennsylvania. Jensen noted in that article that the late antique world insisted also on being a meaningless chaos, and that the church had to save her converts by offering herself as a narratable world within which life could be lived with dramatic coherence. Dreher has a couple other points that will help us resist the drift towards totalitarianism. First, families are resistance cells. For Lutherans, who are inheritors of the small catechism tradition where each area of the catechism is addressed to the head of the household as they should teach it to their children, again, this should be a return to our roots. But we probably need to learn how to do family life again in an era when families are scattered increasingly all over the world. Traditional religion is also a bedrock of resistance, notes Dreher. It calls us to a higher fealty than nation or tribe or company or polis. It insists that the personal is the personal, and I think maybe this is its greatest strength. It insists that the personal is personal, not political. That the personal is eternal and the polis is what is mortal and passing away. At the climax of his wonderful sermon, The Weight of Glory, C.S. Lewis says this. He says, "There are no ordinary people. You've never talked to a mere mortal. Nations, cultures, arts, civilizations, these are mortal, and their life is to ours as the life of a gnat. But it is immortals, whom we joke with, work with, marry, snub, and exploit. Immortal horrors or everlasting splendors. This does not mean that we are to be perpetually solemn. We must play, but our merriment must be of that kind, and it is in fact the merriest kind, which exists between people who have, from the outset, taken each other seriously. No flippancy, no superiority, no presumption." The imagination that could write lines like that had been captured by a vision of what it means to be human that transcended the temporal. This is a strength that only traditional religion can give. We're going to end up standing in solidarity with people with whom we have profound disagreements. For years, the professor, head of the philosophy department at Boston College and Christian apologist and author Peter Kraft, has been calling people to what he calls ecumenical jihad. And by that he means a great deal more than simply Christians who disagree with each other working together in the more narrow sense of ecumenical. What he means is trans-religious cooperation to resist the force of secularity and modernity, and now the way that those are influencing a drift towards totalitarianism. We'll make common cause with people we disagree with on issues that we might have considered primary were it not for the more pressing danger coming upon us. My own congregation lived this out, not this past Christmas season, but a year ago, when we did a community Christmas concert with the local Mormon organization, with a couple more, actually Mormon organizations that came together. The pieces that we chose to sing were purposely chosen to testify to our faith in the incarnation, because that is the point of greatest disagreement between us and the Mormons. But we did it together to say that Christmas is not a secular holiday, and we did that to try and bring our community together and reinvigorate the religious imagination of our community. Finally, he notes that the gift of suffering, or embracing suffering as a gift, will be important if we're to resist the drift towards totalitarianism. The willingness to suffer rather than tell a lie is a testimony to the importance of truth. We're going to need to be disciples, not admirers of Jesus Christ, if we're to survive this era with not just our faith but our humanity intact. We're going to have to at times espouse suffering as the necessary and welcome gift of sanctification in the era in which we live. And this in turn will let us show mercy to those who break under the cultural pressures to be more secular. And we're going to need that. I think of the stories of people embracing and welcoming back into the fold those who broke under Roman persecution. We're going to need to rediscover that depth of mercy in our common life. I'm going to end my review where Dreher begins his book, by recounting the story of a Jesuit priest. In 1943, the Jesuit priest and anti-fascist activist Tomislav Polyazin, and I hope I'm pronouncing his name right, fled his native Croatia one step ahead of the Gestapo. He settled in Czechoslovakia. In order to conceal himself from the Nazis, he assumed his Slovak mother's maiden name, Kolakovic, and took up a teaching position in Bratislavia, the capital of the Slovak region, which had become an independent vassal state of Hitler. Now, he was convinced that if the Allies won World War II, the Russians would invade, and a different and new form of totalitarian would take over to replace that of the Nazis, and he was right. So he organized the church in Czechoslovakia into cell groups. They were able to act independently and consequently not be destroyed as easily by the oppressors who came in the form of the Soviet regime. The powers that were opposed to the church couldn't destroy the church because the church had broken itself into smaller pieces that could all act and study and pray on their own, and then celebrate when they could come back together is in mass. This is a skill we're going to need to rediscover ourselves. And doing so, whether or not Mr. Dreher has accurately discerned the signs of our times, can only make our churches stronger. I commend this book to you as food for thought. I commend many of the things he has commended to us to resist totalitarianism as simply good spiritual practices for us to imbue the faith lives of our churches with. May God bless you as 2020 becomes 2021.